these type of events are always good place to exchange ideas. I'm really happy to be here to host this session with Douglas Mackay. As Andrea has already mentioned, Douglas has extensive research experience on questions about justice and the intersection with public policy. I personally believe that's the type of discussion we need to hear more in policy debates. We're more concerned about technocratic efficiency, which is fine. That's the type of things we need to worry about, but we also need to address this wider set of questions. And Douglas has prepared a very interesting presentation for us regarding the ethical implications of RCTs that, as we are all aware, have established as a golden standard in policy evaluation these days. So let's hear what Douglas has to say, what he has prepared for us. He will talk for 15 minutes, and then we will open a discussion. And well, I invite everyone to join in the chat with your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Douglas.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm very excited to be here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to present here. I'm going to talk about the ethics of policy research, the ethics of policy randomized controlled trials more specifically, and try to argue that there's a real need for more systematic and sustained investigation into this area, into the general idea of policy research ethics. And so just a little bit of background to say how I came to this topic, and I think also to motivate the need for more work on this area. I completed a PhD in political philosophy in 2011, and after that I got a postdoctoral fellowship at the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And it's really a center for discussions of biomedical or clinical research ethics. And so I received a lot of training there. Thankfully, when I finished in 2013, I gave a job talk where I am now at the Department of Public Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. They were hiring their first ethicist. And I gave a talk on international clinical research ethics and talked about concepts that are really familiar in that field: standard of care, the idea of clinical equipoise. And one of the economists, one of my featured colleagues, came up to me after the talk and said, "This is really interesting. We don't really talk about this stuff in my field, which was development economics, and how we think about the use of RCTs there." When I got the job, my supervisor at the NIH gave me a copy of Poor Economics by Banerjee and Duflo and said, no one's really working on the ethics of this. You're heading to a public policy department and you're trained up in research ethics, and so you're ideally placed to work on this. Yeah, and so in terms of my work, I've absolutely found that policy RCTs in particular as a form of policy research, there's just a lot of complicated ethical challenges that arise for policymakers and investigators. I think there's a real significant lack of concepts and principles to address them. So I think that investigators, policymakers running into these ethical challenges don't have a lot of resources that are sort of finely tuned for the policy ethics context as opposed to clinical research ethics. And so don't have a lot of resources to solve the problems that they run into. And if you think about the field of clinical research ethics, the contrast is really quite stark. So clinical research ethics, it's a very vibrant, lively, interdisciplinary field. There's expert researchers who focus on it. There are academic journals and blogs that provide venues for really lively debates. And there's a lot of lines of communication with investigators, policymakers, and also things like ethics consultation services that institutions often offer. So what I'm advocating for is really to develop something analogous. I think there's a real need to develop something analogous for policy research ethics. and think about policy research ethics as a field of research. So by this, I just mean a shared, inclusive, intellectual space for the discussion of ethical challenges posed by policy research, and also systematic and sustained discussion of possible solutions, right? Ways to address these. What are the best practices? What are the best ways forward? So I think, you know, in terms of what this would look like, right? You know, scholarly journals hosting these debates, edited volumes that are devoted to thinking about the ethics of policy RCTs, blogs, conferences, workshops, things like we're doing today. More importantly, I think, though, is that I think that if we envision policy research ethics as a field of research, there should really be a space where it's not just a matter of uncritically applying research ethics codes, research ethics norms, often that have been developed for a different context to problems, but really as a sphere of intellectual inquiry, where we are asking difficult questions, developing concepts and principles that are really tailor-made for the policy research context. And part of this, I think, is needing to develop a shared language. So developing sets of concepts, sets of principles to organize debate and discussion. So what I want to do now is just highlight 5 different areas of the ethics of policy research that I really think need more discussion, more research. So the first, you know, big issue I think that needs more investigation is informed consent. So, you know, there's been some work on informed consent. Nimi Hoffman in particular has written a couple of things showing that informed consent is not always secured in a lot of these studies. And she's argued, you know, quite provocatively in some ways, that there's a real need for a moratorium on policy RCTs until the regulations get sorted out, until this problem is solved. The broader question here that I think needs to be addressed is informed consent necessary for ethical policy research? And when? If it is necessary, when? Under what conditions is it necessary for ethical policy research? I think part of the difficulty here, and I've explored some of this with one of my co-authors, Avi Chakrabarty, in recent work, is that there's a real difference between clinical research and policy research. So in the context of clinical research, informed consent really plays an important role in protecting people's autonomy rights. So we all have a sphere of sovereignty around our body. And so if an investigator wants to put something in our body, an experimental agent or something, then we need to give consent to that, right? Government policy research is a little bit different, just insofar as governments are typically understood to have authority over policy decisions that get made. And so there's a puzzle as to whether informed consent is always necessary in the context of government policy research, insofar as we don't typically think that individuals have autonomy rights over government policy making, in the sense that government doesn't have to get the consent of everyone affected by a policy before it passes that policy. And so there's a puzzle that needs to be investigated further and really addressed. Another big concept that needs to be addressed, another area of research that needs to be addressed, is social value. So social value is a really important concept and requirement in the context of clinical research ethics. And the idea is that human subject research is costly, it's expensive. This is certainly the case with public policy RCTs, and also exposes participants to risk. And so if it's going to be okay to conduct these studies, they need to promise sufficient value to society in terms of knowledge that's relevant for policy, for example. So another broader question is, should we understand this as a requirement of ethical policy research? If so, how should we understand this requirement? And do policy RCTs satisfy it? Should we understand them to satisfy it? So I think when we look at individual policy RCTs, there's a number of challenges they may face that we need to think about very carefully. One is the issue of generalizability and external validity. So will the results of a well-designed RCT apply elsewhere, right? If not, then the value of the studies might be much more limited than otherwise. Martin Ralbion has also talked about knowledge gaps. So the fact that the type of knowledge we produce from RCTs in particular cases might not be terribly useful to policymakers. And so there's a question there about whether the RCT in that case has any social value or maybe has limited social value. There's also situations, common situations, where one government starts an RCT and then another government comes into power and sometimes cancels the RCT. And so insofar as the completion of policy RCTs are subject to the whims of political actors, there's another challenge there with respect to this criterion and whether ex ante we can say that a particular study is likely to be socially valuable. Another issue that comes up is an issue around standard of care. So standard of care is a concept in clinical research ethics and really designates the level of medical care to which patients are entitled and which clinical research participants should be guaranteed, right? So think of it as the baseline that everyone is entitled to in terms of medical treatment. There's a question, right? Should we have a similar concept in the context of policy research? Some understanding of a baseline and interventions that we plan on studying should not threaten to put people below this baseline. So broader question here, should we have this type of concept? If so, how are we going to understand it? What are the criteria for thinking about the level of care or the quality of policy to which people are entitled? This issue really came up, I think, with a recent controversial randomized controlled trial in Nairobi, where one of the interventions was disconnecting the water supply to people who either were unwilling or unable to pay for water services. And so there's a question there about whether people should just be entitled to water sort of no matter what, regardless of ability or willingness to pay, making it unethical to carry out that sort of experiment. Fourth big one is around distributive justice. So random assignment, right, is in the context of policy RCTs, the whole purpose of doing random assignment is that it's good for epistemic reasons. It's good for knowledge creation. The argument, at least, is that it allows us to cleanly identify the causal efficacy of an intervention. But randomization is also a way that we can allocate an intervention. So it's allocation via lottery. And so that raises questions as to whether that way of allocating access to the intervention is fair or not, is distributively just. So I've done a little bit of work on this and outlined a couple of different directions to take here. One is that it could be morally okay to randomize in a situation of equipoise, where there's real disagreement within the social science community about which intervention is superior for realizing the outcomes that we care about. Sometimes we're more confident that one of the interventions we're testing is better or superior to another, and it still might be okay to randomize in that situation as long as we don't have enough of the intervention to go around, and it looks like running a lottery is a fair way to allocate it. I would say that if you look at some of the ethics literature around when a lottery is a fair way to allocate a scarce resource, the conditions when it's okay are actually quite limited. And so we need to think carefully about whether we should be randomizing, distributing access to a promising intervention via a lottery, or in accordance with need, right? Based on who's worse off, giving priority to those folks. Final big concept I want to talk about is community engagement. And so there's been a number of concerns raised around whether well-funded international organizations are bypassing local governments or exercising undue influence on local governments in terms of the research that gets funded and how it's carried out. There's also been, if you look at some of the empirical research around these studies, there's oftentimes lack of buy-in, lack of understanding among participants, among the communities where these studies happen regarding the use of randomization. So it might be misunderstanding about why randomization is being used, misunderstanding about whether the intervention is meant to be aid or research, and sometimes concerns that a fair way to allocate access to a scarce intervention is in accordance with need, giving it to those who are worse off. And so there's another further broader question here that really needs work around whether we should think of community engagement as a necessary condition of ethical policy research. And also, more specifically, thinking about the relationship of international organizations and local governments on the one hand, and researchers and communities and participants on the other, thinking about what the appropriate roles are for all of these different actors in terms of identifying research questions and setting research designs. So let me sum up and finish. So big takeaway, I think, is that policy research raises a number of ethical challenges. And I really think that sustained systematic ethical reflection is necessary to address them. I'm trying to help with this. So I've published a few things on this, and just want to talk about very briefly the current initiative I'm involved in, which is editing an Oxford Handbook of Research Ethics. This handbook, we're just starting to publish chapters online right now. On the one hand, we're really trying to capture all different forms of research. So not just clinical research, but also social science research. So we have chapters on anthropological research ethics, sociology, public policy, experimental political science. And then we also have chapters on these big concepts that I've just mentioned: informed consent, social value, where we've really been pushing our authors to not just talk about how these concepts apply in clinical research ethics, but also more broadly in social science research and policy research. So with that, I'd love to hear what people have to say, perspectives of practitioners, think tankers, both about what I'm missing, what looks interesting. I would say, I'm an academic coming to these issues from a scholarly perspective. I do try to speak to my colleagues as much as possible who are actively involved in policy research as social scientists. But I am, recognize my perspective is limited, and so very interested to hear what people have to say.
Thank you, Douglas. That was really interesting. And please, you can join us through the chat, or if you want, you can request to open the mic, and we can all hear your voice and interact with you. I will give a very brief round of reactions to what Douglas has shared with us now. Well, I mean, as I told you at the beginning of the session, I think this is the type of discussions we are not seeing much in public policy communities and even in the academia. We have been more concerned about understanding impact, understanding efficacy, which is fine, and they are relevant criteria, but we have not been addressing these wider questions. And from your presentation, Douglas, kind of like popping my mind 4 issues, and I would like to hear your views on this. And number one has to do with the epistemological implications of the quantification of knowledge. If my Spanish is helping me out, I mean, what I'm trying to say, I'm from an anthropological perspective. What it seems to me is that the way public policy knowledge is being produced is based on a standard of legitimacy, which puts quantitative evidence much more higher, in much more rigorous standard than whatever else, being quantitative or qualitative or being other forms of knowledge generation. So in a way, when you have RCTs as a golden standard, yes, there are of course many things they can contribute, but also in a way, and that's what I feel it has happened in many places around the world, it has kind of like closed, the scope of what we understand as relevant and legitimate evidence. So I would like to hear your views on that. Number two, what do you think are the implications of, regarding the transferability and the usability of RCT evidence? I mean, what I'm trying to raise here is the fact that the whole RCT, promise is that you're producing high quality evidence that is going to inform policymaking. Are we really sure that jump into policymaking happens that quickly or happens all the time? From what I see, from my part of the world, is that you usually have a big gap between, evidence producers, academia, think tanks, evaluators, I mean, you name it, and the people that are going to actually apply this evidence in sustained policy change. So who is actually mediating in these two worlds, and how is the RCT enabling this mediation or actually making it more complicated? And in that sense, I mean, how much of this mediation is very or highly dependent to global actors rather than local academia or think tanks or networks? And then that has to do also with a question of institutionality. At the end of the day, and that's what people that come to OTT conference, is interested about, is how you create more strong and more reliable knowledge communities, epistemic communities, evidence-producing communities around the world. So how is this RCT Global Drive helping or not, or how can it help to build stronger networks of experts and researchers around the world? And finally, your views about community engagement. The main question I have here is that if people that are being part of these experiments really know what they're getting into in terms of the use that these results are going to have to sustain decisions in very different places across the world. So, I mean, that's my reactions, and thank you so much, Douglas, and many food for thought, and then we'll see what we get from the interaction with our colleagues in the chat.
All right, so thanks so much. Those are all 4 questions, and I'll try to take a stab at every one, but yeah, so I mean, some of these are just, very difficult questions. I think great questions, and, I wish I could pull in some of my social scientist colleagues who run some of these studies to really say more about them. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the implications in terms of thinking of this as a gold standard, thinking of this as sort of the only legitimate form of knowledge, I think it is. I agree with you. I think it is a real worry. This is something we struggle with, even in our department in terms of the methods that we teach to our students. And so we do a lot of different methods, right? We teach people in terms, how to use various econometric techniques, how to do RCTs. And, there's a real push and discussion about whether we should be doing a lot more qualitative research, right? Adding those skills. And so I tend to think, Deaton and Cartwright in their paper that came out a couple of years ago, think of RCTs as a tool, right, among other tools to use. And I think that's a good position to take, just in the sense that depending on what we're trying to know, what we're trying to do with our knowledge, it seems that different ways of knowing, different methodologies are gonna be useful, right? And so we shouldn't think of one methodology as useful in all contexts. In terms of transferability, I think that there's a couple of gaps here, right? I think that one is just around generalizability, and there's a great book by Nancy Cartwright, who's a philosopher of science, looking at evidence-based policymaking, and really looks at, when you get results from an RCT in one area, what you sort of need to have in place elsewhere in terms of support factors and so on to be able to think that the knowledge is transferable. And so, I think that there's difficulty in transferability. but also potential solutions to do it well. And then I completely agree in terms of other forms of gaps in knowledge between, what policymakers need, and also, in terms of the difficulty in the jump to policymaking, right? So one thing, just in terms of sort of come back into the ethical discussions I was sort of putting forward, I do think, these are discussions to sort of flesh out in the context of this requirement of social value, right? And to think about when we're going to judge that an RCT is socially valuable and ought to be carried through, thinking through down the line, right? Where is the knowledge that we're going to create going to be applicable, right? Where is it going to be useful? Is it going to be useful? Are there plans in place such that the knowledge gained is actually going to be translated into policymaking and can be translated into policymaking? So just in terms of, the sort of ethical framework that I've been thinking of, I think that's a good place to maybe locate that. Let me jump to community engagement. And I think, that's one of the concepts that I haven't thought about a lot. And people who are really working in terms of international health research are really developing good frameworks to think about what robust ethical community engagement is, ideas of shared governance between the different actors. And I do think that there's also another related issue that I didn't talk about today, but I think is worth thinking about. Comes up also in the case of international health research, just questions about how the benefits and burdens of research are allocated, how they're distributed, right? And so are the people who are participating in research, right, the communities that we are learning about, are those communities going to see the benefits of research, right? Or is it going to benefit other folks? So, in the health research context, we're sometimes worried about, often worried about, pharmaceutical companies going to low-income countries, testing out new interventions that are really designed for the US market or the market in high-income countries. And those who are actually participants in the research don't get fair benefits of their participation, of their research activity. And so again, I think that's a place, there are a variety of frameworks that have been developed in the context of clinical research ethics, ideas of fair benefit sharing, as ways to sort of address this. The context is different, right, in the sense of, between clinical and policy research. And so I think that, we need to sort of think anew about what fair distribution of the benefits of research is in the context of public policy research. But I think that there's sort of, some resources there to try to build out ideas of what that might look like. And so I know you asked about institutionality, and I'll see if there's other thoughts, but I don't have great things to say about that, but I think that's a wonderful question.
Much, Douglas. We have comments from Guru Charan. Guru Charan, if you like to join with your microphone, you're welcome to do so. If not, I will go on and read your questions. Let me know what would you like to do. Guru Charan is putting two comments that I think are really valuable. Yeah, okay, so I'll go ahead. Thank you, Guru Charan. He says that, the question of community engagement and the growing perception in the global south is that funding agencies and think tanks are bypassing local governments. So, so this question about the relationship with, local governments, which raises a questions about, the governance of these public policy research initiatives. That's one issue that Guru Charan is raising. And the other one, which is more an observation that has to do with the following question. What gives think tanks or social researchers the legitimacy for policy research? Do they draw it from their accountability to their grassroots constituents? How do they claim to be the voice of the community or necessarily reflect the felt needs of the community?
Right. So yeah, I think those are both excellent questions and both get this idea of community engagement. So on the one hand, I think we need to think carefully about, in terms of relationships between local governments and international organizations, oftentimes that have funding and are well resourced, about who should be setting the priorities, who should be designing the research, right? And I think that there's different ways to think about this, but I think you can put an argument together that says that, look, it's local governments that have primary responsibility for the well-being of their citizens. They have sovereignty over policy making, and so maybe subject to some sort of wide conditions, we might think that they should have most of the control over which types of research get prioritized, over how research is designed. So there's broader debates in global justice that sort of get implicated here, right? About whether we should think of, I think one sort of model of this is we have these well-funded international organizations that are sort of coming and being charitable, right? Where we are providing resources out of the goodness of our heart to help you develop better interventions, promote the well-being of your citizens. And so then it looks like these donor agencies, these donor organizations can have more strings attached, right? Because they're sort of acting charitably. Another way to think about it that's been developed in thinking about global justice is that countries have a claim of justice, right, on assistance from international organizations and high-income governments. And once you sort of put it differently, having a claim of justice on these resources then goes with that the idea that they have more autonomy, more sovereignty with respect to how they deploy those, right, and how they actually develop research programs and set priorities among them. In terms of legitimacy of researchers, I think as far as it goes for policy research, I think that researchers are, particularly when they are using public dollars, right, or engaged in research that is authorized by the public, I think that they're accountable to the public, right? The way I think about it in my own work is that, just sort of think about what's the role of research, right? The way I think about it in my own work, I think that other ways in which research ethicists think about it is that governments have obligations to their citizens. They have obligations to create wealth, to promote opportunity, to promote healthy communities, to do a variety of things, ensure high standards of living, and so on. Sometimes the problems we face in realizing a more just society are lack of resources, political will, right? Other times they're more knowledge-based, right? We might have limited knowledge about how to improve opportunities for people in certain communities. We might have limited knowledge about how to promote public health. And so that's where the role of research comes in. And so I think that ultimately research is, in policy research in particular, is an instrument to create a more just, a society that has more well-being than less well-being in it. It's a way of promoting a better society, a more just society, and really helping with those knowledge barriers. One thing to say, and this is sort of another question, is I think that another interesting ethical question is just thinking about how think tanks fit in here, right? Insofar as it's easier to make this sort of public argument when you're talking about public resources, public researchers, and becomes a little bit trickier when we're talking about private money, right? And think tanks that are more not necessarily beholden to the public. And so there's a sort of further ethical question about how we think about the differential obligations of different types of actors.
Thank you, Douglas. Also, if some of you have experiences doing RCTs in your own organizations, it will be great to hear your views. Okay, so moving on with this interesting discussion, Douglas, you were, at the beginning of your presentation, you said that you you were going to argue for the need of a systematic research agenda regarding RCTs. Yeah. So what would you say would be the key issues that this agenda has to address? What questions would you open up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, community engagement is a big one. You know, I think that it is not a topic that I have, I mean, in terms of like the ones I would sort of prioritize, I think community engagement is a really big one in terms of what that looks like, what the right model is for thinking about, you know, the different responsibilities of local government and funding institutions. You know, based on sort of my read of different stakeholders around RCTs, this is something that it comes up again and again in terms of concerns, right? And so I would put that forward as a really big sort of project to work on. And as I said, I think there's models for this. You know, in the context of international health research, there's models that we can sort of use and apply to a different context. The other one I think is, you know, a lot of your questions at the beginning are really nicely tie into this idea of social value. And I think that there's, you know, my read of the literature is that there's a lot of really good discussion right now. I think in the wake of Kramer, Banerjee, and Duflo winning the Nobel Prize last fall, there's a lot of discussion about the value, right, of RCTs, right, as a methodology. And I think that I'd love to see people sort of connect those discussions to ideas of social value as a requirement of ethical research, and to sort of flesh that out and see what it looks like.
Great. And I don't know if someone else would like to join with a question or comment, please feel free. So regarding to this, you know, quest for social value, Douglas, what would you suggest for the donor community, you know, that are supporting research across the globe? What can they, you know, do better to make the best of the RCT global drive? I mean, I think, I mean, we have to be fair and acknowledge that this RCT culture has helped to, I would say, strengthen the evidence-based culture in many government structures across the globe. Other things that I would say that is valuable from this RCT, you know, global drive is that it has been able to reach different audiences outside the academia. I see that it has been embraced with a lot of interest from, for example, the private sector, the entrepreneurial communities. And I think that's something positive in terms that we need to take these policy conversations to a wider and more diverse audiences. I mean, however, as we have been discussing in this session, there are many things and many arenas in which we can expect improvement. So what will be your message for the donor community that are supporting RCT research? How can they help to support a stronger policy research agenda across the globe?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I would say a couple of things. So one is, you know, I think that there's general debates, and I would say, you know, this is sort of a new field that's just been coming out in the last couple of years. You know, there's a really good ethics literature on priority setting in healthcare, right? You have limited resources. Where do you put those resources in terms of funding different types of healthcare interventions, right? The next type of discussion that's now really being front and center that I know a few people who are working on is priority setting in the context of research, and biomedical research in particular. And so there the question is, which types of biomedical research should be prioritized, right? Oftentimes by government funders, for example, but also for private funders as well. And there you have metrics in place, right? Like, you know, the global burden of disease, where you have ideas of which conditions are sort of worse for people that are leading to the greatest number of healthy life years lost. And so really, I think what needs to happen is we need to take a sort of third step and think about priority setting in the context of policy research, right? And so, just thinking about the sort of intellectual exercise there is identifying areas of public policy where we don't know very much about what works, but also where the stakes are incredibly high, right? Where if we could figure out what would work, we could really substantially improve people's lives. And so, one thing is, you might say a lot of the interventions to address global poverty sort of are a good place to start, right? In terms of, there is a strong ethical value, ethical principle of priority of the worse off, right? The idea that when we have scarce resources, scarce research resources, they should go to those who are worse off, right? Understood in terms of expected well-being. The other thing I would say, so I think that's a sort of big debate to be had, and it's sort of something that's very important to think about, is where is sort of the knowledge needed, right? The other thing I think to think about is, places where we can be confident that knowledge that is generated by policy experimentation, there's some sort of like take up or implementation plan. So, I think we've already seen that there's various types of gaps between, policy research and knowledge that's useful for policymakers and implementation of policy research. And so, the other sort of consideration is, are there commitments, or can there be commitments from policymakers to implement things that prove to be effective, right? And so I sort of think that's sort of the other criterion here, right? You need both of those things: identifying where your research dollars can do the most good in terms of generating valuable knowledge, but then also thinking about where there's institutions in place such that we can be confident that the knowledge is actually going to be made use of, is going to be translated into promoting people's well-being.
Thank you, Douglas. And we have a question from Andrea. Andrea, you're welcome to join with your mic and video. Okay, great.
Hi. I was listening to you, very interesting principles, really good food for thought on them. And while listening, I was wondering if you can you share any examples where these principles have been executed properly? So for think tankers and people who actually do them, to see good examples of community engagement, of standard care, of distributive justice. Because sometimes when you're starting with this, it can be difficult to see, okay, so how do we do this? If these are questions that we're not asking ourselves, we might not know where to find answers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have any examples off of the top of my head. And part of this, is just sort of the limitations of my knowledge. One of the things that I need to learn more about is the actual practice of research. This is something that I need to get involved with more, I would say. The one example for the handbook, actually, we have someone writing a chapter on the highs and lows of research. And I think that one example of socially valuable research, so I would say research that has proven to be socially valuable, is an RCT that was conducted in the 90s in the United States, called the Moving to Opportunity Experiment, where the general question was thinking about whether moving families from high poverty neighborhoods to low poverty neighborhoods can have positive effects for those families. And so they did this randomized controlled trial where they randomized participating households to either a regular housing voucher, which they could use wherever they want to help get affordable housing, no intervention, so there is no voucher given, and then an experimental intervention that is was a housing voucher that was only usable in low poverty neighborhoods. And so what they found is that the levels of income expectations, opportunity, college attendance rates were a lot higher for children within households that moved to these low poverty neighborhoods, as long as they're younger than 13 when they moved. If the children were older than 13, they didn't really see benefits from that. And so that's a really valuable piece of knowledge in terms of how to improve opportunities for low-income children. And now some of the people who did follow-up studies on the Moving to Opportunity experiment are now experimenting around the United States in terms of what are the mechanisms by which we can get families to relocate if they wish to low poverty neighborhoods. And so they're doing further work, a mix of qualitative and quantitative research in Washington State, and showing really positive results that, one thing you might say is that people just have a strong preference not to move into low poverty neighborhoods because they have strong communal ties and so on. But it turns out that if they're provided with information and some assistance in securing housing in some of these low poverty neighborhoods, they're willing to do it and prefer to do it. And so we're gaining sort of valuable knowledge about how to redesign our housing voucher programs that could be really useful for young kids in promoting opportunity, college attendance, all of those good things. So I think that, that's an example of a study that, you could really point to as having high social value. It is being implemented to some extent in different jurisdictions in the United States. So it's something that has a policy impact. Of course, there's always problems of political will and changing governments and so on. And I also think that, thinking about, the other thing I talked about was this problem of fair distribution, right? This is a program that, is not an entitlement program in the United States, which means that there's never enough funding to provide housing vouchers to everyone. And so there is a good case to be made that, though I think this is a little contestable, that randomly assigning people to different arms of the study was morally okay. It was an example of fair allocation of a scarce resource. So I think if you press me on that, I'm not sure how confident I am in that judgment, but I think that there's a case to be made there that was a study that had a lot of social value, looks like it's having a lot of policy impact in a really important area of people's lives, and was planned and conducted in an ethical manner.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Douglas.
Yeah. But the other thing I would say, if I may, like the other thing I would say is that a lot of, in terms of a lot of these standards, right? So like standards like informed consent, community engagement, I think that the first thing that we need to do is sort of provide good arguments for why and when these standards need to be met and what these standards should look like. And so I think that, I don't want to be seen as just sort of outlining, here are these criteria studies need to be made, but there's actually need to work on these and to think about how they apply in the context of policy research. And so I think informed consent is a good example of that, where, we need to have a discussion, have a debate about when it's necessary, whether it's okay sometimes to do these cluster randomized controlled trials where we're randomizing among different community groups. Do we always have to get individual consent, or is it sometimes okay not to? And when might it not be okay to do
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you. And Christina, you're welcome to join. If you would like to make your comment. If not, I can read. I mean, it has to do with the set of issues. Okay, that's all right, Christina. I'll try to explain it in the best way I can. Christina is raising a question regarding the connections between this ethical debate and the RCTs. She's asking, is this ethical debate about how to do RCTs ethically, or is an ethical dilemma about running an RCT at all? So, I mean, that's a great question to move to a wrap-up session. How do we frame this ethical debate properly in the RCT agenda?
Yeah, I think so. I think the answer is like both of those things. So I think that you know, a lot of the ethical debate we need to have is about how do we do RCTs ethically, right? So when is it okay to randomly assign people to different interventions, right? What's the standard of care that we need to secure for participants? Do we need to get informed consent from people? And if so, do we do that in an appropriate way? So that's one debate. I think that the other side of it, though, goes right to your question, which is that a lot of these criteria, right, when they're not satisfied, when we can't satisfy them, then it won't be permissible to conduct the study, right? So, you know, if a study doesn't promise social value, if our ethical principles suggest we need to get informed consent and there's no commitment to do so, right? If we can't, you know, we look at our principles of distributive justice and how, whether it's fair to allocate people to intervention and control arms, and the study as we've planned it suggests that it's not ethical to do so, then I think that these principles are going to also have implications for we should not do the study. And so, you know, I think that, you know, just as an example, there's a big debate right now in the biomedical research ethics world about whether we should do challenge studies to try to accelerate the discovery of a COVID-19 vaccine. And so what's controversial about these studies is they're not traditional RCTs where we give half of the people an experimental vaccine, half the people a placebo, and then see what happens, right? Instead, what we do is we take a small number of people, we give maybe half of them an experimental vaccine, half of them a placebo, and then we deliberately expose them to the virus to see whether it works. There's been a massive, you know, number of papers, blog posts that have been published since March on the ethics of this. And some of them are about, is it ethical to do this at all, right? And some people say, no, it's not ethical to do this at all because you can't satisfy those criteria. But those criteria also tell you if it is doable, right? If it looks like it's ethical to do it, exactly how to carry it out to ensure that it's ethical. So these criteria are really ones that tell us how to do research ethically. And in some situations tell us, no, you cannot do that form of research. You cannot carry out that proposed
Thank you, Douglas.
protocol.
That has been really interesting. A lot of food for thought. Just let me ask a last question. I mean, what would be your advice for think tanks, universities, you know, that want to strengthen their public policy research agenda? What would be your priorities or suggestions on how to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is sort of like, you know, a bit, you know, I'm an ethicist, right? And so, you know, I'm really in favor of, I think it's a recent trend. I think it's happening with public policy think tanks, public policy departments and schools engaging more with ethicists. So I think that, you know, one place this is happening is in the wake of Nobel Prize win last fall. There has been a lot of good ethical discussions about RCTs, right? And so I'm really thankful for that. And I think that there's more emphasis on that. The other thing I would point to just as a trend, and this is just sort of my seeing, you know, the sort of world of academia, a lot more policy schools and departments are hiring ethicists, right? So they're not just hiring social scientists, they're hiring ethicists, they're teaching required classes. My department, I think, was sort of one of the first to hire an ethicist as sort of a tenure track person. Oxford has hired an ethicist. Syracuse School of Public Policy has hired an ethicist. Georgetown hired an ethicist a few years ago, and the Evans School at the University of Washington is hiring an ethicist this year. And so I think that, you know, it's good. And I think there's sort of a role for think tanks to engage with ethicists. There's a lot of folks who have expertise, can think about ethical issues in a policy relevant way in an applied context. And I think, you know, reach out to them. And I think that that's a way to get some conversations started.
Thank you, Douglas. I mean, thank you so much. You had a great presentation. I think we all benefit from your knowledge, from the questions you're opening up. That will, I believe, inspire everyone, you know, to not only improve our institutional agendas, but also think about the implications of our own research work. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session.